is really difficult. I've been fortunate enough that I've been working part-time up until recently, so that's helped a lot, but I'm in the process of transitioning to a full-time job right now. And it's going to take some adjustment. I think that my collection probably got a little bigger than I'm going to be able to reasonably handle with a full-time job. So I'm probably going to have to really focus in on what projects I care about the most and let a few things go. The other thing that I'm probably looking at changing up is, up until recently, I've been breeding my own feeders. And that is just incredibly time consuming. And so I'm probably going to be working to try to get as much as I can onto frozen so that I can balance that out. The other piece that makes it challenging is I have a pretty aggressive show schedule that I've been trying to keep up with. And that is probably also going to change a little bit. I'm probably going to have to dial back on some of that. In addition to the snakes and the job, I also have 4 kids and I homeschool a couple of them. And so there's only so much time in the day. So it can be a little tricky. So with ball pythons, it's largely what I started with early on when I got into the hobby. And I do find it really interesting to work some of the long-term morph projects and kind of, see where they go. That part of it's really fun for me, that it's been a really, good way to play with some of my interest in genetics and that kind of stuff. And so that's what I really like about the ball pythons. With carpet pythons, it's a very different thing for me. I tend to do more locality type things with carpet pythons. For me, they're so fascinating. They're such interesting animals. They're on the move, they're out, they're doing things. Once they start eating, they almost never stop. They're fun to take care of. They're just, to me, they're just the perfect animals. I love carpet pythons. So it depends on kind of where people are in the hobby. I've known some people who have gotten into carpet pythons very early in their keeping, and they can do quite well. I think especially if they're looking at something more like a bredli or an inland that's a little bit tamer. I think people who aren't particularly used to snakes can be a little taken aback by particularly hatchling carpets. They're a little bitey. They at least aren't going to hurt you very much, but they can be a little nippy and just need a little bit more care in terms of people learning how to use a hook and that sort of thing. So I usually don't recommend carpets as someone's very first animal. That said, ball pythons, a lot of people I sell to are early in their keeping experience, and generally ball pythons are gonna do fine. I know sometimes people, question whether they're a great starter animal because of their tendency to go off of feed, that sort of thing. But generally, it tends to be easy enough for them to keep them. All that said, my main recommendation is going to be to get what you love. That's going to be the animal that you take the best care of. That's going to be the animal that brings you the most joy. And so, if carpets are your thing and you're new, get the carpet if you really want it. All the stuff that it takes to learn how to manage a bigger or a little bit more active animal can be figured out over time. Producing your own feeders is an interesting journey. My first bit of advice would be that it's going to take dramatically more time than you think it will. When I had a smaller collection and I wasn't breeding as much as I am now, I probably spent 3 times the amount of work taking care of feeders that I did taking care of my snakes. They take a lot of work. I would first of all question whether you really need to do it. The main reason that I keep feeders is because I keep ball pythons and they can be trickier to get to eat frozen animals sometimes. And so that tends to be, having the option of feeding live tends to make things a little bit easier. The main thing that I would suggest when you're getting started is, consider what kind of feeding needs you have. I do both, not just both, I do rats, ASF, and mice. Depending on your situation, you may need rats, you may need mice. You can kind of figure that out. Get good breeding stock. Early on when I started, I just kind of grabbed whatever I could from the local, PetSmart or whatever, just to get a couple of animals. When I switched to getting animals from other snake keepers who really know what they're doing and have had time to build up their lines, I was able to get animals that produced more and generally were a bit healthier and did better. So the quality of your breeding animal really matters. Also, the quality of what you feed your animals really matters. There are a lot of different kinds of feeds that people offer with a lot of different pros and cons. I use Missouri. For me, it's what's worked the best. I have the least wastage from it. It tends to do pretty well. I also supplement. That can be a really big deal with rodents. I have a mix of all sorts of stuff that I'll put into a supplement mix and give them. They're really fun, but they're a lot of work. Mice for me are the worst. I have the most cannibalism problems with mice. I don't really have cannibalism problems with my rats or with my ASFs. The rats will eat an animal that has already died of natural causes. That's a way that they try to deal with the decomposing kind of scents and keep it under wraps because the scent bothers them. So they'll eat an animal, but they aren't going to kill, a whole bunch of babies or that kind of thing like you'll see mice do, where you find just like half mice pieces lying around and it's really gross. And then my ASFs are just amazing. They're bitey, and so I don't just stick my hands in with the ASFs, but they are the most prolific breeders. They are easy to breed. You just keep them in a set unit and they turn on, will breed for about 9 months and then they turn off. And when they turn off, the retired breeders are still big enough that I can feed them to like my ball pythons and stuff, which I love because I don't really currently have anything that's big enough to feed like my retired rat breeders. It's always nice to not have to waste stuff. With ball pythons, there are so many different morphs out there that it's really just a matter of finding something that's interesting to you. Finding something I think that isn't super, super, super common. It's a lot easier to develop a name for yourself and kind of stand out if you're doing something that's a little bit off the beaten path, especially if we're talking recessive genes. There's a million clowns up on Facebook, not on Facebook, on Morph Market, there's a million clowns, but there are not a lot of tri-stripes or black axanthics, or there are a lot of different recessive morphs out there that you could get into, and it can be a little bit easier to kind of start standing out that way. And I specifically call out recessives rather than incomplete dominant genes because there are at this point so many incomplete dominant genes with ball pythons, and there's so much overlap, and there's everyone and their brother has a Dinker project that they're working on. And some of those genes have a future and some of them don't. And some of them are the same thing as 5 other genes. And you definitely want to have some of those in your projects. But in terms of having something different that really stands out, I think getting into one of those off the beaten path recessive projects is a really good way to go. In terms of carpet pythons, my main piece of advice is red light are the best. Get them, get inlands. They're my 2 favorites and I love them so much. So that's going to be what I recommend because I think they're amazing. But just like anything else with carpets, I haven't specifically gotten into jag. I think I came along late enough in the hobby that it was just easy enough not to go that route. Don't particularly care one way or another if other people are doing jag. It's just what I've kind of chosen not to do as I've gotten started at the point where I've gotten started. I think the really fun thing with carpets to me is all of the natural variety that you can get in species. And so some of the species where you're going to see some of the most natural variety and some of the more ability to line breed are going to be things like Darwins. I think regular, normal Darwins are severely underrated because albinos show up and people tend to focus more on the albinos. But there is a lot of variation in Darwins and they're absolutely stunning. IJs as well. There's so much potential with IJs and the ability to, work one trait or another. So there's a lot of cool ones.